it doesn't get much cooler than a water-cooled Browning M250 cal. Wait, you know what? Yeah, it can. Give me a second. Oh yeah. That'll do it. Hey everyone, this is John from EastCoastArmory.com, and I'm here today with a new product announcement video for two new 1/6 scale MG items. The first being the water-cooled M2 conversion set, and the other being the 200 round 50 cal tombstone ammo can. All of these items and similar items have been listed on the ECA catalog page, which you'll see the link right there popping up on the bottom portion of the screen below, but you can also find the direct link in the video description. There I have not just these two units that have been posted, but all the other MG detail hop-ups and cradle mounts, not to mention pedestal bases, can be found on that page as well. The model that you see here is built for my own personal collection and is not for sale and or purchase. However, as I often mention in these videos, I take on commission build projects from models ranging between 1/35 scale and 1/6 scale. For availability and pricing information, that would be best by contacting me through the email address listed below, which is info@eastcoastarmory.com. To start this video off, let's go ahead and take a quick walk around this model. And this is the water-cooled version of the Browning M2. The M2, of course, is a legendary HMG that was designed by John Moses Browning in the early 1920s and has been in full production and constant service since that point onward. The system is not just used by the US military, but is also used by many other countries around the world. However, this here is a very interesting and unique version of the Browning, where this one is water cooled. The standard Browning that's in constant usage is either an M2HB or the M3, which is primarily an aircraft version, but this here is essentially where it really all came from, as this version here sort of predates the other two. Of course, the concept of the Browning goes all the way back to World War I, where the need for an anti-tank weapon was starting to become more relevant, and it was thought that 12.7mm or 50 cal would be the best way to go, learning some lessons from the Germans with their tank of air. The military developed a round first, and then they kicked it up to engineers to go ahead and design a weapon system to shoot it, and this is where Browning and a few other designers and engineers stepped up to the plate. Essentially, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Browning just took his M1917 design, which is chambered in 30-06, and scaled the thing up to 50 BMG. After a few years of tinkering, the design was basically finalized in the early 1920s, and the original water-cooled version of the Browning entered service with the US military in 1921. At the time, these were produced by Colt, and these entered into production, stayed in production in this manner for a little while. However, in 1933, some shortcomings with the original design were found, and these were addressed in this version here of the water-cooled M2. This here would be the version that would be in production from that point onward and would see extensive service in World War II. The biggest attribute that this type of system has over the standard air-cooled variant is its sustained fire roll. One bane about MGs is that you could put a bunch of rounds through it, but eventually the barrels will overheat. Water cooling really solves this solution, and because of that, this thing has a much longer, higher rate of fire compared to air-cooled counterparts, specifically single-barreled air-cooled counterparts. The biggest drawback, of course, is the insane weight that the water jacket does have, as well as also the other accessories that need to go with it, like the condensing tank and the tubes and things like that. Another bit of equipment that was developed around the 1940s timeframe was the tombstone ammo can. This allowed the ammo can to hold 200 rounds of belted ammunition, which is much greater compared to the standard ammunition can, which was a single belt, which again would have been 100 rounds. Because of the combination of the heavy weight and extra accessories needed for the water cooling system, and also with the unit being able to fire for longer durations of time, this made this system ideal for emplaced static use. And specifically in context of the 1920s 1920s and post-World War I era, the unit was primarily used in an anti-aircraft role. And this unit saw widespread service all throughout World War II, from the beginning all the way to the end in the Pacific, as well as also in the Atlantic. And of course, several were also stationed stateside as well. Another user of this system was the US Navy, where they procured a significant number of them, and these were used for anti-air roles on board ships as well as submarines of the 1930s and early 1940s period. Even though both the water-cooled M2 and the Tombstone saw extensive service during World War II, by the end of the war, with the advancement technology for both airplanes as well as anti-air systems, this type of a system over here was deemed to be obsolete, and the US military removed all of them from their inventory. However, the Tombstone continued to stay in service because it was a bit convenient to have 200 rounds on tap, and this system would still float around the US military inventory throughout the 50s, 60s, and probably into the 70s when they finally were scrubbed from inventory. However, even though that's the case with the US military, there are still photographs out there of the Tombstones still in service today in several places around the world. The water-cooled M2, though, not so much. That's basically been relegated to the dustbin of history. And here's the project at the start of the build. What we have on the table here are all of the major components that are going to be used on this model, from the M2 receiver, from the water-cooled barrel attachment, to the pedestal base, and also the cradle mount. Almost all the components on the table right here are listed on the ECA catalog and are a standard catalog item and listed for sale. Also, pretty much all of the items on this table are made out of 3D prints. The only components that are cast resin and are also not for sale are the actual receiver section for the M2HB itself. Several of the other detail components, like the pedestal base as well as the cradle mount here, have been featured in previous new product announcement videos and can also be seen on several other videos posted on this channel. The real star of the show, of course, is the water-cooled conversion set for the M2. So for the M2 itself, this set is designed to work and convert the M2HB kit from Dragon. The Dragon 1/6 scale M2HB kit is one of my personal favorites. In fact, I'll say it's the best available option, or one of the best available options in 1/6 scale in regards to an M2HB. Another that's also based on the same tooling is the version from ZY Toys. Both of those options are excellent. They have been fairly prolific on the market, and for the longest time were fairly easily come by. This, of course, is subject to change with supplies being what they are. However, the ECA set is intended for use on both of those. The ECA set may potentially work on other 1/6 scale M2s on the market, be it from Armorpax or 21st Century Toys, if those ones are available. However, I believe you may have to make some slight tweaks to the connecting point itself in order to get the piece to mate onto those receivers, but I believe it should still work out if that's what you have access to. For the build, I have this resin one here as a stand-in. This resin example, like I frequently mention in my videos, is a direct resin copy of the Dragon tooling. This is something that I use for my own personal builds, and it's not listed for sale. Because, again, I build a lot of American vehicles and subjects, and I tend to need a lot of browning. So trying to purchase a bunch of Dragon kits just for the receiver, it's not really that beneficial. So what we have here is just a standard resin duplicate of the Dragon tooling, again, just for my own personal reference and my own personal build. At this point here, the unit is mostly pre-assembled. I got the major assembly sections already completed, being the receiver sections. The bulk carrier group has already been fitted in place. And at this point here, I'm actually going through the bodywork sections. I also went ahead and completed the butterfly spade grip assembly, and this piece literally just drops directly in place like so. And this is something that, of course, will be done after the next steps, and you'll see why in a moment. But there you go, as this here is the receiver for a standard M2. Of course, all that is just academic and leads us to the main event and really the whole purpose of this video, which is the new water-cooled conversion for the Browning M2HB. So here we have the main component of the set. The set consists of these two parts right here. We have the main jacket as well as the sprue that I'll get to momentarily. The jacket itself is a single printing and has all of the necessary details printed on. The only thing that's missing is a length of metal chain, which will be supplied with the sets, but at the moment, obviously, it's not present on the table. However, these are supplied with the sets. The remainder of the detail is all integrally printed on, being it from the jacket itself, from the retention nut section, and hopefully this gets into focus, but you can also see the bushing as well as the muzzle section right over there of the 50. Note the square cutouts found on the one bushing section, and also the geometry present on the actual retention nut itself. On the bottom portion here, we have a small little fastener. And all of the details, by the way, were heavily lifted off of a real M2, or a real water-cooled, I keep wanting to say M2HB, a water-cooled M2 that had some excellent photographs of, and I was able to go ahead and bring those into the example that we see presently. So back to the model. From the fastener section here, we're going to the front sight base. The piece is on an elevator little bracket. I guess it's a spacer, best way to put it, and it's actually riveted in place. Or those, no, they're actually slot screws. Correction, those are slot screws, and yes, the slot screw detailing is present. The front base itself is in this little hood section that's guarded, and then the sight is actually adjusted with these two tiny little fasteners that are found on the front and rear for windage and I believe elevation, or I think the other one's just a lock section because the elevation is done with the rear sight. But either way, we have the front sight detailing right over there. It's in a little housing, and yes, there's even a little hole on the top so you can actually adjust the front sight accordingly. And all that detailing is still present. I'm not sure if it's going to come out on camera, but rest assured it is there. I remember doing the coating or the CAD work for that. Continuing down the cooling jacket itself takes us to the fitting section. This is where things get pretty interesting. So on the bottom portion here, there's this, looks like a T-valve, and this is exactly what that is. This is actually the drain for the water in the jacket if you want to drain it out. You would open this up, and out the water would come. On the top portions, we have the actual steam vents for the water. Remember, these things being water cooled, when the barrel heats up from shooting, the water boils, turns to steam, and the steam needs to come out. Generally, these would come out of two little fittings that come out of these sections over here via rubber tubes, and they would go into a condenser box, to which then the water would turn back in, the steam would turn back into water, to which then you could top it back off if need be. I believe some systems also had a pump system, so you had a continuous flow of water, but that's more of a topic for forgotten weapons. Anyway, on the topic over here, we do have the fittings present, and they are on either side here. The fittings are fully detailed with the mount section that would be, I believe, brazed to the jacket itself. And the fittings, which on the real one are brass, and I'm going to have to paint that on this as well as the front section, which we'll see as the build continues. But all of the hex bolt or hex fitting detailing is all present. And note, these pieces are hollow, because if you want to make this or render this section with the rubber tubes in place, you have that ability to straight from the get-go. On this section here, we have this little flat area with these two little lugs protruding out. As for what they are for, I believe they are for mounting of some other bit of equipment, or even just mounting onto a different type of cradle if need be. The piece itself literally just plugs directly into this receiver over here. Now, I did have to make some slight modifications to this, widening the hole somewhat, as this piece is slightly oversized compared to the original Dragon one from what I can tell. I may address this, or it's honestly not that big of a deal to make the mods to the receiver, but either way, when the time comes, it's just going to get glued in place. And then, yowza, does that really change the look of the M2 quite immensely. Definitely a unique look, very iconic, and it's one that honestly I've been wanting to make for a very long time. Honestly, since Dragon made these kits, I'm like, oh, you know, it'll be sick, an A&M 250 and a water-cooled version, and I've done both, so here we go. So that's the main portion of the conversion. The second portion of the conversion is found on this runner right here. So this consists of the fittings, which on the water-cooled version, there are two options of fittings. We have the versions that are for the water cooling with the tubes with the condenser, which I do not have yet. And we have these versions here, which are just the standard cover cap variants. And these, again, would be brass fittings. And they have the correct geometry to them. They are hollow on the inside, so it plugs directly into these sections here. And we have a small little eyelet present on these areas for use of the chain retention system. On that note, I forgot to mention that in the center portion here, we have another eyelet ring integrally printed on, and that's again for the chain that would hold those two caps in place. So when you're using the unit, you take those off, plug those other ones on, and those other pieces would dangle around, and it prevents you from losing them. The other component to mention is the rear sight, and this is where the water-cooled version of the M2 is vastly different compared to the standard HB variant. So on the standard HB variant, we have the rear sight in this section over here, and this is your standard M2 HB rear sight. It's a little ladder sight / peep sight. When it's down, it's a peep sight. When it's up, it's a ladder sight. And we also have this mounting bracket here for some sort of an optic. However, when the units were originally designed, specifically with the water-cooled variant, the rear sight was very different compared to the stock one. And the piece actually was almost a scaled-up version of the rear sight assembly from a M1917 Browning. Hard to imagine why, because both are designed by the same guy, but either way, we have here the appropriate rear sight for the M2 water-cooled. So the unit is as thoroughly detailed as I can humanly make. This piece would be bolted to the rear portion of the receiver via these three fasteners, and they are slot screws. We have a giant windage knob right here, and this entire portion would actually rotate left or right. And I'm not sure if you guys can see the detailing that's integrally printed on, but you can see this little curved section. That is where this piece here would be able to pivot left and right. The whole unit would actually rotate like that, to a certain degree. This section in the middle is actually a spring clip, and on the real one, this would actually keep the piece either in the down position, or when you flip it up, it snaps in the upright position as well. And on that note, here we have the ladder / peep sight. Note, the peep sight is hollow right from the get-go. And the ladder sight also has all of its detailing present with its gradations right here on the side. Not sure that's going to pop up on camera, but it should definitely come up when the thing is painted. And we also have this really complex setup here where we have another peep sight over here on the bottom, this other one on the top, and on the real one, this whole unit could go elevate up and down. Obviously, I didn't go that far on the 3D printed one, but all the detailing is present. One thing that I did do is I made the ability for the piece to be functional, where as you can see there's a tiny little hole integrally printed on these two sections here, and you can actually pin this thing together with a little piece of wire, possibly a sewing pin. Don't know yet. I'll see once the thing actually gets built. You'll also see that I doubled these sections up just in case something bad were to happen. These are pretty frail. You have a backup set at your disposal. Continuing further takes us to the pedestal base, and this one here is the M31C mount. This is something that's actually the subject matter of another new product announcement video that was posted a little while ago. However, this one here is finally the first one I'm going to be able to assemble for my own personal collection and needs. In the past, I would utilize just one of my old school cast resin ones that was on the ECA catalog since about 2005 or so. However, with those molds wearing out, I decided to put those ones out to pasture and replace them with a 3D printed counterpart. And here goes one of the production samples here. Although this one here is a misprint, it's missing the little T-handle mechanism, but that's something I could easily cobble together, which is why it's not being used for an order. As I always mention, the parts that get actually shipped to customers are as good as they possibly can be, and something like this would definitely be verboten. So for this one here, it's perfect for my needs. The set is the version that has the 3 legs that descend downward, and it gives the tripod or the pedestal a little bit more support, specifically when bolting to a vehicle, namely a Jeep or something similar. For this application over here, it's definitely going to be necessary because of the added weight of the water-cooled section. Of all of the pedestal bases that I have, I think this one's probably one of the best options for this. Also, one thing I do want to mention is that the fasteners are located in two separate sections because they are different sizes. The fasteners for the travel lock here are found on the travel lock sprue right over here. So this avoids any confusion. And the remaining fasteners that are used to secure the angle supports to the brackets here are also found on this section all the way on the bottom. Again, just to prevent any confusion. When you're assembling one of these, you don't want to mix up the pieces. Just assemble accordingly, and you should be good to go. Also, on the legs, one of the pieces has this notch cut out in this section over here as per the real unit, and you'll see exactly where this piece gets fitted once the unit is fully assembled. And the next thing to mention is the actual cradle itself. This cradle here is the E10014 5030 mount. This again has been a topic of a couple other videos that have been posted in the past, and this was actually one of my favorite cradle mounts, which is why I kind of used it for this one here. However, there are different options out there on the ECA catalog for cradle mounts. This one is just one I tend to be a little bit partial to. Anyway, these cradle mounts are cool because they could mount either an M2 receiver or an M1919, and I have displayed both of those options on the ECA channel in the past. The units are extremely detailed, as I've mentioned before, with all of the appropriate detailing, including the cast marks and well beads, chain eyelets. Basically everything that would be on the real one would be present on these. These sets here are all designed to work with all of the ECA pedestal bases. As you can see, this guy just drops directly into place without any fuss or muss. And it's a perfect fit. The inner portion, it has a lot of really intricate and unique geometry to it. On the real unit, these two pieces would be purely cast, which is why we have the interesting geometry features that we do have. Hopefully the numbers come out in light. And if it doesn't fly out of my hand, you can see the other interior details here, including the small little fastener hex nuts that are integrally printed on, so you don't have to fiddle with those little things. When you're assembling it, it's ready to go from the get-go. The next thing is this runner over here that has the remaining parts to flesh one of these out, which would be the tray slide mount, as well as the tensioner, or I should say the can holder, as well as the belt tensioner. Like I mentioned before, this system here can mount either a 50 cal ammo can or a 30 cal ammo can in this little section over here, and the belt tensioner just puts some constant pressure onto the belt just to prevent it from flopping around and possibly causing a malfunction. The other little accessory is this little piece over here, which is the adapter that makes the piece fit either a M2 or a 1919. However, I'm probably not going to be using this setup here for this mounting because I actually have something else that I designed which I think would be really appropriate for a water-cooled M2. As for what it is, well, let me go ahead and clean off the table. And that would be this new set that we have here. This here is another bucket list item I've been wanting to produce forever now. So having this paired with the water-cooled, it definitely feels really, really good to get not one, but two things crossed off that list. And what is this exactly? Well, this is the 1/6 scale ECA 3D printed tombstone 200 round 50 cal ammo drum set. Yes, because when 150 cal Freedom Pills isn't enough, we need to double that up. The tombstone ammo can is an iconic bit of equipment from the World War II time frame, and is one that stayed around in service with the US military for a little bit of time, but it's actually still in service today. In fact, I recently just saw a picture of a Turkish M113 with a quad 50 mounted on it, and guess what? It had these units fitted in place, so they're still floating around out there. Most notably, like I mentioned before, they are typically thought of when you think of the quad 50 setup. In fact, I actually have a couple videos of a quad 50 with these cans in place, and one of them is actually shooting full auto, or at least one of the MGs are shooting full auto with blanks, but that's semantics. Anyway, back to the set that we have here. This set is actually more than appropriate for use on this particular version with the water-cooled jacket, because with that unit having the water-cooled nature, it was more designed for heavy sustained fire, and because of that, the 200 round belt would be more than adequate. In fact, when you see the water-cooled units generally mounted on their own M3 tripods, or the other heavy-duty mounts that those units are typically mounted on, you'll generally see them fitted with the 200 round tombstone. However, this thing was a common interchangeable part, and this unit here can be mounted on any of the cradle mounts that are in US inventory. So the M23 cradle, even the other various components or the other various mounts that are out there, many of which I produce and are on the ECA channel, can be mounted with this setup here. And on that note, all of the ECA USGI cradle mounts can be fitted with this unit over here with 0 modifications being required. You simply just drop this thing in place and you're good to go, which we will see as the video goes on. So back to the setup that we have here. This is the new ECA 3D printed component, and this setup here was one that I again wanted to always produce, so finally having to get to it was a little bit of a labor of love for me. So the setup itself is all comprising of 3D printed components, with the exception of the metal bits of hardware that we have here that are going to be used to fabricate the handles as well as hinging of the various pieces of equipment. You'll also notice that the piece is fully detailed with its interior spool as well as its external detailing, and this was something I wanted to do. I could have taken a shortcut where I could just molded the whole thing or rendered the whole thing as one integral piece and just roll with it from there. However, what's really the fun in that? Since I have the opportunity to, and with taking advantage of the technology and the printing technology that we have of today, I figured, you know what, it's time to make something that's a bit special, and I could go the extra mile. So that's what I went ahead and did. As for the external detailing, you'll see that all of the details are represented. And by the way, on the ECA catalog, there are 2 options available. This option here is a version that has the font and the labeling that is integrally embossed into the metal, and the other version is fontless. There are about 3 or 4 types of these cans out there. I know, American stuff and variations, surprising, but I figured it was an easy way to go ahead and add a little bit more differentiation by having some separate options. There's also another variant out there that doesn't have this conical section over here, and it's just flat. Perhaps that's something I could also look into as time goes on. But for the time being, right now what you see here is the sets that are available with the text and sans text with the conical section here on the stampings. So back to the actual quality of the parts, you can see that we have all of the detailing present, from the rigidity angle section there to the handle mount, which replicates the stamped sheet metal type fabrication. We could also see the stamped sheet metal type features, where this piece here, the centerpiece, would be a single piece of steel, and the 2 side sections would be stamped and then spot welded in place. We have the hinge detailing right over there with the hinge plate. As you can see, it stands above the actual spine. We have the mounting bracket set up right over here. And as I stated before, this is meant so that it could lock on with any of the ECA USGI mounts. Or I should say the USGI cradle mounts, because there's the one mount that has no capability of mounting an ammo can to it whatsoever, but that's neither here nor there. Then we have the top portion that has the rounded area. As you can see, it has that stamped sheet metal look like I stated before. We have the 2 little fasteners on either end, and the fasteners are actually correct, where this side here is just the head of the fastener, while on this side here there's a nut with a little bit of the fastener protruding outward. We also have the hinge right over here with the correct shape. We have the latch, the locking latch mechanism right over there. As you can see, it replicates the stamped sheet metal look perfectly. Same is true for the opposite side. It is drilled out or integrally printed hollow. So the pieces, so no drilling is required, just essentially just pin everything together. On the back portion here, you can see that rigidity section, again, lifted right off the real one. And we have the interesting section over here where the rounds actually come out. And there is some interior detailing here, and we'll see what that looks like once I remove it off the sprue. The other bit of detailing to mention is the spool itself. The way these things work is that you would spool up 100 rounds into this section over here, and then you would overlap the remaining 100 rounds in this section, and when it feeds, it would just pull on the first 100 rounds, and when it gets to the bottom of that, we'll start unspooling from the top section. And to do that, we have the spool, and it has all the interior detailing, which includes the belt clip mechanism right there, which it's like spring load on the real unit. There are these 2 little rollers here, and you would take the belt, line it up, and this section here would snap over the belt, and then from there, you could then wind this thing up, and it would spool up all your 100 rounds. The piece, of course, is printed hollow. The pin and the other bits of hardware are printed on, but they are concealed under the tombstone here, and we'll see what that looks like momentarily. With the units removed off of the plate here, you get to see the remaining parts still on the sprues. So here we have the actual hinge pin for the spool, and the piece itself has some geometry to it where we have these little slots that on the real one would be machined into these two sections. This is so you could use a wrench of some sort to help with the spooling, but the hole over here would be used for the actual crank itself. The other sections are the clips, and as you can see, they are made, or the real ones will be made out of a single piece of sheet metal that will be folded and stamped into shape, and that detailing has been brought over into the printed ones. And in typical ECA fashion, I give you not one or set but enough for two in case a incident were to happen. So you do have some insurance in that regard. As for the other parts, here we have the main body. As you can see, the detailing is in the front section over here where we have the belt tensioner system. These two would be rollers, and this piece here would be this little snap ratchet mechanism that would just prevent the belt from sliding back into the can. You also get to see the geometry on this section over here, where we have the fasteners that hold the rollers in place. And there's another roller, by the way, on the bottom. You can probably see that right there. Again, all integrally printed, so no sub-assemblies are required. It's just good to go straight from the get-go. But you can see all of the detailing from the fasteners as well, including the nut with the little bit of bolt hanging out from the opposite side. Same thing with this one here, with just the head of the fastener. And the same detailing is true for the ones on the top also. So pretty thorough. Also, on the rigidity angle straps that we have here and here, you can see, hopefully it comes out on camera, that it's not just flat. You actually have the natural crease and seam line of these two sections where they make contact with the sheet metal of the body itself. Again, just giving more accuracy to the part and just being more thorough with it. For the top section, on the inner portion here, there's really not much to mention, except for that the conical section is actually through and through, where I could easily just make this flat on the inside, but no, I actually went ahead and scalloped it out just like it would be if it was stamped on the real unit. When it comes for removing these parts, just the clean cut snips work fine. And just like with the other parts, the materials these ones are very similar to injection molded polystyrene. So just a few passes here with a piece of sandpaper. What is this? 400 grit, I think, maybe 320. Either way, I was able to just polish down the little remnants that were left from the sprues. Although you have to be careful on the body over here because they're located in 4 locations, and you have to be cautious not to over sand or potentially damage the hinge or the tensioner mechanism. So if you're careful, use a needle file or a little bit of sandpaper strategically, you should be just fine. Similar story is also true for the top portion here. There are 4 little pegs that connect it to the runner, and these are easily snipped off. The 2 here are really easily accessible. A few passes with some sandpaper and you're good to go. And the 2 on the corners over here are still easily accessible with a needle file as well as some precision sanding, but you just want to be careful not to make contact or hit the hinge section, as obviously that can cause some problems. On the spool itself, I just hit the sides here with a little bit of sandpaper as well as a few passes with my snap blade, just so to make sure everything is nice and smooth to alleviate any potential issues of the piece not fitting right. The piece does fit, it's designed to fit. However, I noticed on this one there was a small little bulge from the printing process, something that can happen, but it's something that's, again, not a concern. As you can see, the piece just slides directly in place. Here's the unit getting its legs installed, and the assembly is actually going by without a hitch. So the piece just literally plugs into the section here. Of course, you have to deburr everything first. You have to snip the trees off and then do some deburring. With the material that these are made in, these are not SLS anymore. These are actually made out of a resin print. This is something that may be subject to change, but so far the resin print seems to be doing the part really, really well. The deburring is more easily done with this material compared to the nylon, which is abrasive resistant. It still can be done. You basically just use like a X-Acto, like over here, to just remove any of the material. But this stuff here, it has the properties more like traditional polystyrene, so it sands and files down like a dream. So with that in mind, once you do the deburring process, matter of fact, I'll go ahead and do it on this one. Looks like I forgot to do it, which is great for you guys. So with the X-Acto, just a few little swipes like that. A few little swipes with some sandpaper. And the piece is now completely smooth. This guy here just locks into this section like so. The holes do line up perfectly. And from here I could go ahead and install the fasteners. So I gave you just enough bolts to do the job. But I did supply extra hex bolts, or hex nuts, because those are the pieces that tend to get flung off Lustpartia more easily. I'm just going to go ahead and just scrape any residue from the sides from the printing process. I'm not gouging or whittling, I'm just going ahead, just going up and down the surface here lightly, and also the burr, like that. And then from here I'm just going to go ahead and slide the piece in place. Once the holes line up, of course. And there you go. Perfect. Do the same thing with the last one. Once those are fitted in place, I'm going to go ahead and remove these two hex nuts right over here. Of course, you just want to do a slight little deburr. Nothing egregious, just a little piece can be chopped away. After that, I'm going to add a little drop of glue to the opposite ends right here. Like so. And then I'm just going to drop the nuts directly into place, and they just slide on without any sort of problems. I'm going to add just a little bit more glue on this one, not a whole lot. And there we go. So the legs now are done. And now I'm going to go ahead and install the travel lock. You have two holes for mounting the travel lock, but generally I always see them mounted on the top portion here. And then the bottom one lines up with this hole, and then there's a pin that you can fabricate that locks everything in place. And ta-da. So normally this here would be fully assembled, and at this point you can actually mount it to a vehicle. This would be mounted with these four sections over here, which you could use an actual real fastener for that, along with the ones here on the feet. But for this one I have to fabricate the T-handle, but that's neither here nor there. The other thing to mention is with this notch on this leg over here, this one, it's on the right hand side. So if you are mounting this onto a vehicle, this would be the front of the vehicle over here. And for some reason this leg here has a notch in it. As for why, no idea, but they do. So if it's on the real one, it's going to be on this one. From the pedestal base brings us to the cradle. This goes together ridiculously easy. Did it off camera within about 5 or so minutes, and the thing was good to go. This now takes us to the receiver itself, and we're going to actually, this is the fun part where I'm going to modify this thing and convert it from an M2 HP to an M2 water cooled. And to do this, the first thing that needs to go is the rear sight section. To remove it, I could go about a multitude of different ways. I could just hit it with a file, and I'll just file the section down. You could use a Dremel with a high-speed removal bit, and to remove more material, this being cast resin, it should just file away very easily. Or I can even throw it on my mill if I could find a way to mount the receiver without crushing it. But I think that's a little overkill. I think the best way is probably the file, but we'll find out. Whatever choice that you go with, the rear sight needs to go, so that's absolutely crucial. The front sight also needs to be deleted as well, but I'll get to that in a moment. The reason why I need to delete the rear sight at this time is because at this point on the receiver, it's actually going through its bodywork. With the way the Dragon Kit is designed, you do have a seam to contend with, and I've already polished down the seam here on the front, the seam here on the lower portion, and I'm now working on the top section. And here's the unit fully assembled and is about to slide off into paint. But before I do, I just want to say it actually looks really, really good in this format. So the unit is radically changed compared to your standard infantry M2HB or even an AN M250. So starting with the assembly, like I mentioned before, the entire front end literally just plugs directly into place, and once the glue's set, you're good to go. You also get to see what it looks like with the rear sight also fitted in place as well. Really changes the look of the unit immensely compared to before. The piece, by the way, is fully functional in that it flips up like so. And I do not work for Century Arms International, so the sights are not canted. They're actually lined up appropriately. Not sure if it can come on camera that way, but it is. And this one's going to be really fun to paint. Oh, on this one here, I had a casting issue or error with the one little lug over here. On the real unit, this lug is used to get some leverage in order to cock the M2. Originally, when these things were designed, this whole plate here wasn't in existence, and the charging handle was just a large knurled rod that stuck out of this portion here of the receiver. I think there was another version that had another option, had another lug sticking out the other side, and you could grab with both hands and pull back. However, because to charge this thing, it's actually pretty difficult because of how powerful the spring is. It was designed at some point to have this reinforcement plate over here that has this lug built in and this lever for the charging handle. By doing this, this allows you to pull down on this section over here, and it gives you some leverage in order to unlock the bolt and actually charge the thing. And that's one aspect on these M2s. So technically the Dragon ones are, and they're all, by the way, all the 1/6 scale ones are wrong in that you can't have the piece function where it pivots down in order to rack it and then it locks back. But we're talking about 1/6 scale model here. So, but that is something to keep in mind. So if you are, and what I'm basically trying to say is that if you're trying to model any M2 and you have an action figure, say you have like a vignette and the guy's racking it, you want to make sure that the charging handle isn't upward in this direction, it's actually sideways like that, because it has to pivot and then it's able to pull backwards. So that's something you want to be aware of. Back to what I was saying too before, so when I casted this piece, this section here just didn't come out. There was an air bubble, so the piece was gone. I sanded everything down and I replaced it with this new unit here. It's just a lug of 3D print sprue that I had floating around. It's the perfect size. I added a little notch into it because it's like a giant slot screw. Glued it in place in the appropriate location. Once everything is fully painted and weathered, it's just going to blend right in. Aside from that, all the other functions on the M2 are still exactly the same. The top feed cover pops open, and you still have all the internal detailing, as well as you can see how the bolt actuates when you charge it. On some builds in the past, I would put a little spring on the inside so it has some kind of return motion. However, because these pieces are made out of cast resin, they are much more frail compared to the standard polystyrene ones. So in my experience, it's a cool feature, but it's one that you can't really take advantage of because of the frailness of these parts here being made out of cast resin. But for a static model like this, it's perfectly suffice. I just love the look of these things. With the units all fully assembled and ready for paint, before I go ahead and do that, I might as well just go ahead and show what everything looks like assembled in this type of condition because, well, frankly, it looks awesome. So you can see the water-cooled M2 right here mounted onto the cradle mount. You'll notice that the piece is front heavy. That should definitely not be a surprise, and the real one would definitely also follow suit. Which is why generally you don't see water-cooled M2s mounted on this type of a setup. Generally, you would see them mounted on a more elaborate type cradle system that has a counterbalance spring, and those are generally also meant for a use, so they have a higher angle, and it makes shooting at a higher angle much of an easier endeavor. Having said that, because it is a standard M2 receiver, it will work on any of the cradle mounts that are out there that are USGI spec. be it this pattern or the other patterns that I offer on ECA. You could even throw one of these on an M23 cradle, which would probably be a smarter move because that one actually has a coil spring as a counterbalance, and that one probably fare a little bit better compared to these ones over here that are counterbalanceless. But they still look awesome nonetheless. And here's the unit fully assembled. The unit went together ridiculously quickly in about like a minute or two. I had everything all squared away and to the condition that we have here. Let's go ahead and take a look at the outside sections. So you can see the metal is bent into the shape of the grab handles that are found on each side. These of course are pivotable and are functional in that regard. The latches are also full function. They do both keep the unit, well, when they're clipped down, they keep the unit closed, and then to open it, like the real one, you just pinch these two sections over here, and then the unit can open up. On the inside, you can see how the spool is fitted in place and how it is being able to fully rotate without any sort of problems. The pin is not glued on, and it's just temporarily placed in this section over here, and can be pushed out, which is important because I am going to need to temporarily remove it in order to get everything painted. Because trying to get paint into these areas here once it's fully built, let's just say less than ideal. There's the pin removed. I did have to do some hand fitting to the pin. More than likely it's because of the printing process. I am going to go ahead and slightly revise the sprue layout so that the pin is printed in a way that'll make it more concentric and make it in a shape that's more true to form as opposed to horizontal, which because this printing method left it slightly oblong. So, but that's neither something to worry about. On the production ones, this will definitely be addressed. And this is why we do pre-production samples. But with that little verbiage out of the way, you can see how the spool just slips right out. And reassembly is still very easy. It just drops in place. And the pin slides in until you have approximately an equal amount of material sticking out from each side. About a millimeter or so. Here it is compared and contrasted to the other tray, but before I do that, you can see how everything opens up very smoothly. No inhibitions, it doesn't stick, or also when you close it, it's nice and flat. Now, one thing I do want to mention is that this also depends on how good of the sprue you remove. When I first assembled it, it was sitting slightly ajar, not a whole lot, and that was because I still had a slight little remnant left on the surface. So when you're building one of these things, just want to make sure that you properly remove the remnants so that once it's removed, the piece will literally just drop directly into place like you see here. And there's no springing action or anything like that. There's no stress on the hinge. Everything is at rest as it needs to be. But it really has such a killer shape to it. I love the way these tombstones look. So, like I was alluding to before, here's the tombstone compared to the standard 3050 ammo can tray. Much different geometry. These are still cool in their own right. They're really, really awesome. But again, tombstone, just so many cool options out there. As for the mounting bracket, as you can see, is intended to be cross-compatible. And now for the moment of truth, let me go ahead and grab the cradle with the water-cooled M2s placed in temporarily. Actually, you know what? Let me just go ahead and take the M2 off for the time being. Okay, so with the M2 removed, this little section over here is what the tray or the can slips onto, and right now this isn't get glued onto the cradle. This gets done after it's painted. But either way, if I hold the unit, slide this bad boy in place until the seat's all the way in, and now we got 200 rounds. And here are all the components fresh from paint and weathering. At this point, they're ready for final assembly. But before I do, I might as well take the opportunity to go over all these components now in their final form prior to the thing getting assembled. Starting with the tombstone, here's what the piece looks like now in its final format, and it definitely looks much better compared to before, and it already looked awesome before in the white, if I say so myself. But now that thing has been painted and weathered, everything really comes out, and the piece looks absolutely killer. See, the handles are still fully functional, of course. Same is true for the one on the opposite side. To open it up again, you squeeze these two sections here. The piece just hinges open, just like the real one. The drum here is able to fully rotate. All of the weathering was also done to the interior portion too. Obviously, with the way the rounds would be stacked and the way they would feed from this section, the inside would get scratched up periodically. So I went ahead and incorporated that weathering into the model here. The rollers also have a little bit of wear on them. Again, this is where the belt would be fed from when the thing is installed and when it's firing. And it's going to look great once slid into place onto the cradle. Here we have the pedestal base in its final format. Unlike the previous ones that I brought on table 4 where they were cast resin, this one here is 3D printed, and as you can see, the 3D print is absolutely flawless. And if I didn't say so, or I didn't mention it, someone would probably guess this was cast resin or made out of some kind of type of material. Definitely not 3D print. Hopefully it gets into focus here, and you get to see the texture up close. No prep work was done to the part in regards of like sanding or any type of polishing on the surface. The way you see it here is exactly how the thing was assembled. Travel lock is still fully functional. There's a little paint scratch in this area over here. However, this thing isn't exactly going to be used much on this setup, but as you can see, the piece is still fully functional either way. This takes us now to the cradle. Just like with the other parts, this is again all 3D printed, and again, with the camera brought in nice and close, the piece is absolutely flawless. Really impressive, the type of 3D printing that we have here. Same is also going to be true, by the way, for the water jacket. Of course, this is painted and weathered in my usual format. This one here is actually painted with my darker shade of olive drab to exterior latex. Unit, of course, was first spray painted with flat black. Then the airbrushing was done for the base. And then the piece was airbrushed with the weathering, which was a little bit of cream to get some modulation going, as well as also some Tamiya flat black. Tamiya panel line accent was then utilized to get into the nooks and crannies, like right over here into the casting marks, and then dry brushing was done to seal and complete the look. Of course, the chain work was also done with the chain retention pins. These are, like I always mentioned, standard on these sets here and come with them along with the retention pins themselves. The pins also have their little intricate handles that are bent out of wire, and then everything's just assembled in place. And this now takes us to the water-cooled M2, or the M2WC. This here was a really fun unit to paint. First, the entire thing was painted in flat black spray paint, and then I gave it a diluted wash of Tamiya NATO Black, and this does a good job of emulating the Parkerization look that is very commonly seen on American weapons, specifically from this time period. I have seen a few options. You could go with the grayer type Parkerization, or you can just go with the standard flat black. Either way will work on M2s, specifically the water-cooled ones, but this one here I wanted to try something a little different, so I went with the NATO Black wash effect. The remainder of the weathering was done my usual method with use of dry brushing on the high areas over here, leaving for the stress look on certain locations. The handles are painted in two different colors. On this one here, I went with NATO Brown for the spade grips, while the cocking handle I went with Tamiya Hull Red. Then Tamiya Clear, Gloss Clear was added to the following locations, giving you for the sheen look. Like I always mention in these videos, these things are made of a multitude of different materials, from wood to Bakelite, and Bakelite comes in a rainbow colors from black to reddish brown. And for this one here, I went with the dual effect just to give a little bit of extra contrast. But again, you have a lot of artistic licensing available to you. For the flip-up sight, the areas here that have the graduations on them are just painted with a little swipe of silver paint. This is something I have seen on a lot of water-cooled Brownings, namely the 30 cal, but also several of the 50 cal examples, and I rendered it here again just for a little extra color. Piece, of course, is still functional. as you can see. Top cover is still fully functional, and I also weathered the inside over here with the dry brush, given for the results that you see presently. But the really cool aspect, of course, is the water-cooled jacket. And there's a lot of color going on over here. So, first thing I want to mention on the front section, where we have this large fitting section, this would be brass on the real unit. And the inner sections over here would be silver in color, or like a chrome type color. For this was painted with my silver spray paint. With the paintbrush, I carefully applied it into the appropriate locations. And then for the brass, I actually use a gilding gold paint, which was also applied via the paintbrush. For the paint, I use this stuff right over here. I absolutely love this stuff. I've used it many, many times in the past. It is a excellent color, far better than the Model Master stuff. It applies very, very smooth, very effortlessly, and dries pretty quickly. So, and this is actually a fresh bottle. I just picked it up because my old one just eventually got dried out. But this stuff here, cannot recommend it enough. And I picked this up from Michael's, but I'm pretty sure you can find it in any craft store or Amazon or what have you. All of the brass fittings are painted with this gold color. And even though it's gold, it does replicate the look of brass quite nicely, which is why I utilize it. And on that note, this takes us to the other fittings found on the cooling shroud. We have the valve right here on the bottom. Carefully apply with the paintbrush in the appropriate locations. And we have the fittings up here. These were also, again, carefully painted. Note the fittings, how they stick above the threaded section that would be on the jacket itself. And the two top fittings over here, the cover caps, are the ones that I mentioned before. And they are just popped into these locations over here. Since this one does not have the circulation tank, I'm going to leave them in the cap format. But these pieces are just held on with friction. I could usually just pop them off, but I'm not going to. No reason. You'll see that the piece is chain retained right here. The chain, of course, is also, again, supplied with these sets. And they connect to that center eyelet that I was referencing before. And once it's done, it really has a really cool and unique look to it. These things are just awesome the way they look. And this one here is a very good representation of the real counterpart. Well, now that everything has been documented and photographed as well as got on video, it's now time to do the final assembly. So I'm going to go ahead and start with the receiver. I'll put this carefully into the unit right here. Just slips in like so. This guy here is a travel lock, as I've mentioned in many of these videos. But this pin here is the actual receiver lock pin. It slides in. Make sure that the holes are lined up. No hand fitting is required. You just got to make sure that the holes are lined up appropriately. And then the thing just slides right into place. Once the pin is fully seated, it's then time to do the rear pin. Make sure, again, everything is lined up appropriately. And this guy here just wiggles himself in once you find that happy sweet spot. And as usual, it's one of those things that's easier said and done off camera, but I'm still able to manage and muscle through. Okay, so this guy here is now attached to the cradle. Again, no glues are utilized. It's just held on, just like the real one, with use of the pins. Take the tombstone. I'm going to slide this guy in place. There we go. Fully seated. Now, it's time to just drop him onto the cradle, where it usually makes a nice satisfying click. Let's see if it does that. Not so much this time, but still satisfying nonetheless to have the unit fully pinned together. And once everything is painted, this is what the final end result looks like with everything connected together. Leaving for the pretty awesome and imposing type setup that we do have here. And although, like I mentioned before, in this setup over here, it's not really how you would see a water-cooled M2, but with that out of the way, it's definitely one that looks pretty sweet in my opinion. The difference with the can holder is that it is a bit heavier compared to the standard ammo tray holder, and because of that, if the pedestal base isn't anchored down to anything, it's going to want to lean a bit to the left hand side, as you could probably see. However, that's only because this unit here is just sitting freehand and it's not bolted or mounted to anything firmly. If this thing was bolted onto a vehicle, like I'm simulating right now by holding the feet down, you'll notice that it straightens up very, very quickly and efficiently. It's also interesting now that I have a water-cooled example of an M2 on hand to compare and contrast with the standard classic M2HB. Of course, this one here was the topic of another one of these videos that I posted a little while ago, specifically when I originally designed the cradle mounts. But here you get to see what the standard air-cooled M2HB looks like, although this one's not quite standard because it does have the flash suppressor on it, compared to a water-cooled M2 in comparison. So, of course, the major part being the receivers are essentially the same, although the rear sights are a bit different. So with the camera brought in closer, you really get to see and appreciate better the sights found on the standard M2HB. On the front portion over here, nothing really much to go into. There is a hooded front sight where we have a blade in the middle with this nice little thick sheet metal section that is positioned over here in order to protect it. Where things get interesting is in the rear section. So on the standard M2HB, we have the following rear sight block, where it's made out of steel stampings, although on this one it's a bit more interesting because it does have this little extender piece that we see here, and this is something that, it's not necessarily World War II, but it's definitely something that would be seen at the very end of World War II, possibly, but it was definitely more commonly seen on M2HBs in the post-war years into the 50s, 60s, and going on further. Where there's actually an optics rail in this section over here, and when I say optics rail, I'm not talking about a Picatinny rail. I'm talking about this dovetail type system where an optic can actually plug into this area over here, and I have seen them at military vehicle shows. In fact, I even produced the optic for the 50, and it can be found on the ECA catalog. Older school item, made in resin. Perhaps someday I'll replace it with a 3D printed one, but that remains to be seen. Anyway, nowadays there would be a piece of pick rail over here, and you could have a giant EOTech, as I've seen, and a bunch of other optics that are outside the scope of this video. But either way, the standard iron sights found on the M2 are very similar, if not identical, to the type of pattern we have on the 1919, where it is a peep sight in the folded down position, where you have your little peep sight over here, just like you have on an M1 Garand or an M16, something along those lines, and you just line up the front post with the peep sight, and you have your sighting picture. The unit is pretty well protected with these two wings on either side. However, if you want more control over aiming, you can actually flip the entire unit up just like so. And now you have a ladder sight, which is fully adjustable by turning this little knob over here, and it elevates and depresses that little section, and it goes on a track. And there is a sight in there, and it allows you, again, a better sight picture. That's a bit more controllable. Like I stated before, very simple, very effective, and this unit has basically stayed the same for the last 80-something years, with or without the exception of the extender section that I just mentioned. However, if we compare that to the water-cooled M2, you will again see a sight that is more representative of the era where this thing was designed in. Like I mentioned before, this setup here is more or less what we see on the Browning M1917, which again is very ornate, has a lot of little gizmos on it, and the water-cooled M2, as I referenced before, is no exception. So this one here can not only be used as a peep sight, as we can see, and as I mentioned before, we have that cool, we have the front sight right here on the front of the water jacket, where the bladed front sight is, of course, is no longer present. And on the unit, the peep sight can actually be adjusted for windage. But again, if you want to elevate it into a ladder sight, here you go, and you have your other sight right over there. And now you have windage and elevation that you can control, and the little knob is right over there, as I may have referenced before. These units, by the way, are bolted to the receiver, so with just the use of some fasteners, you can swap them out if you choose to do so, but that's hardly ever done, if ever. So once these units are fit in place, they tend to stay there. However, it's really cool to compare and contrast the two sights side by side, And it's one of those features that makes the water-cooled M2 very interesting, I find. I believe there might have been several early production versions of the M2 with the air-cooled jacket that also has the 1917 sight on it. I'm pretty sure that's the case. I definitely know that this little reinforcement plate over here was absent on some earlier production versions, specifically ones made by Colt, but that's really more or less a topic for Ian from Forgotten Weapons to go into more depth. However, it's still cool to dabble in those waters from time to time. One other thing I want to mention is also the color. This one here is just standard flat black spray paint and weather-tinted format that we see here. While, as I mentioned before, this one here, I gave it more of a gray Parkerized look with the effects that I also referenced earlier in the video. Again, either color is completely accurate for World War II and onward, and it just really depends on which one floats your boat. Of course, though, the most iconic and noteworthy change is with the front end. So here we have the standard HB variant with the coolant jacket right over here, as well as the standard barrel. Of course, this one's got that little extra flash suppressor that I mentioned before. This, by the way, is the original ECA one made out of cast resin and wire, and since then this was replaced with a single 3D printed unit, where it's just one unit plugs right on. But again, shameless plug out of the way. Either way, here we have the standard HB variant, and now we'll compare that with the water-cooled. And again, just a much of a different animal altogether, and it's amazing just with the swap out of some parts, you really get to transform the unit into something completely different compared to what we typically see. Also, to keep things interesting, of course, this guy was going to make a show, or an appearance. Here we have an AN M250. Of course, this is also the topic of its own video. And so we have all three versions right here on the table between the HB, the other variant of an air-cooled, and the thick boy water-cooled. It's amazing what you can do with a Browning. Of course, what's one more shameless plug among friends, but all of the mentioned accessories, be it the conical flash suppressor, the A&M 250 conversion, or the water-cooled M250 conversion, are all listed on the ECA catalog page in the video description. And needless to say again, not just are all those items listed there, but so are all the cradles, as well as even the pedestal bases. Well, not him, because he's been retired, but the other ones are all listed on that catalog page. Moving from the MGs takes to the pedestal bases, and this is also something I've been wanting to compare and contrast with since I first released and designed this set and added to the ECA catalog, phasing this one out about a year ago. And finally, well, I have a production unit in hand, so we could go ahead and discuss this. And to compare and contrast, of course, here on the right-hand side, we have the current production units found on the ECA catalog, which are all 3D printed and have all the amenities and features that I referenced earlier in the video. Well, to compare and contrast it, this here is where it first came from. This here is the OG ECA unit that was released and designed back in 2004. And this unit here has been on the ECA catalog literally ever since, up until about 2023 or so, where it was time to officially put this one out the pasture and have it go off into the sunset. But it actually had a very good run. The original ECA unit was made out of cast resin and gave you the pedestal base itself. It also gave you the little mounts here for mounting on the tripod legs, and it gave you the bulkhead angles found on the bottom plate. In addition to that, it gave you the little vise mechanism right over here that we see presently. It's kind of funny how things change even though they still say the same. However, where the older sets were limited was again with the molding technology I had of the era, being 2004, where these little blades over here were independent casted pieces, and this also includes the bulkheads on the bottom, and you actually had to literally cut them out, deburr them, and glue them carefully in place. Obviously it can be done, but it was a bit tricky. Or I should say it wasn't as easy for the end user compared to the new edition one. The other thing to mention with the older unit is that the amenities such as the travel lock mount, and the travel lock receptacle that we have here on the bottom were not included, and these were things that had to have been scratch built by the builder. In addition to that, some other thing that had to have been scratch built by the builder were the legs themselves. The legs are actually made out of pieces of plastruck angle iron that are glued together, forming the T shape, and then you would go ahead and fabricate the feet, as well as drill out the sections for the use of brass fasteners. Again, definitely doable, but all of the mentioned accessories were not included with the ECA set, and the builder was on the hook to do, or I should say to scratch build all of that. Again, back for 2004, it was perfectly adequate, but you could see why I've been wanting to phase it out with something that was a bit more end-user friendly. And that all of the lessons learned from this one, of course, carried over into the new one, and it's because of this old school setup over here is why the new one is as good as it is. Also, I have better references now than I did back in 04, but that's neither here nor there. However, it's still really cool to see exactly how parts evolve, specifically with better advances in manufacturing and design. And in the end, there's nothing much more I could have anticipated out of this build that I didn't get with the final end product. I had an absolute blast working on this one from start to finish, sitting there at 2 a.m. designing all of the bits in CAD, be it the water-cooled M2 conversion or the 200-round tombstone. Both of these items were on my bucket list, and I've been wanting to design and craft for many, many years now. And finally, with the CAD technology that I have access to, not to mention the printers that I have access to, it just all came together for giving us the final end result that we see here. Definitely one that feels great to scratch off the to-do list. As we know, I am a huge fan and connoisseur of the Browning M2, well, the 1919 also, but definitely the M2, and having the water-cooled M2 is definitely a unique version that I feel absolutely great to finally have under my belt, as well as also represented in my collection. The unit itself is a very unique version of the M2, and like I stated before, it was kind of overlooked for many years, although Hasbro did dabble with it briefly in the early 2000s time frame, but other than that, this version was basically just straight up ignored and forgotten up until now, and that also feels really, really good. As I mentioned earlier, both of these components were on my to-do bucket list now for over 10 years, and I'm glad that I got to it now as opposed to when I first had that wild impulse all those years ago. Because now, with the manufacturing materials and technology that I have access to, these components here would not nearly have been as good if I would have built them when I first had that impulse all those years ago. So again, this is one of those situations where getting to something later as opposed to sooner was definitely one that paid dividends. As I often mention in these videos, the Browning M2 is an awesome piece, and it's one of those components that acts as the cherry on top of your American vehicle. And one way to add more differentiation to your collection is to mix things up a bit, and you don't want to have the same type of Browning mounted on the same exact type of platform every single time. It tends to get a bit monotonous. But if you want to add a little bit of flavor and spice to your collection, you could do so by just swapping out certain things on the MG. Either this could be done with the pedestal bases, with the various cradle mounts. Now you can even add a 200-round tombstone to that setup, or you can even have several options of M2s to begin with, be it a standard M2 HB, or you could roll with an A&M 250, or if you want to go something really bizarre and crazy, you could roll with a water-cooled M2, and for the most part, you should be good to go. Because I guarantee you something like this, hanging on the top of your GMC, or your Jeep, or even your Sherman, will definitely be an eye-catcher. Although admittedly not 100% accurate for those setups, it's still something that would definitely turn some heads. And there's really nothing much more needs to be said about that topic. Which is actually the perfect point to wrap up this new product announcement video for the 1/6 scale ECA water-cooled M2 Browning conversion set and the new ECA 200 round 50 cal tombstone ammo can. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe to this channel where it's a great way to keep up to date on new posted content, being new product announcements like this video here, or my typical type of content being 1/6 scale project update videos and smaller scale model showcase videos that frequently get posted. Another way to keep in the loop of new posted content is by liking us on Facebook. There, I have more photographs of this particular unit, as well as also the other builds, both small and large, that have been showcased and posted on this channel in the past. Furthermore, don't forget to swing by EastCoastArmory.com, where all of these components that I mentioned in this video are listed on the catalog pages, as well as other smaller and larger scale builds can be seen there too. Thanks again for watching. I'll be seeing you all again on the next one. See you there.